Hello and welcome to True Crime Rocket Science. How are you all doing? Today we're going into episode 3 in What Else Do We Know? We'll be looking at 12 additional points from 43 to 55, 56, and this is just for the August period. It goes all the way. There are a total of, I think, 114 points just dealing with mid to the end of August, and basically these were just points that as I learned things for the first time, I just put them down chronologically, and so that just deals with mid August to the end of August, and then I went further September, October, November, and I think I stopped updating it around about October this year, 2019. So we're just going through the timeline and just seeing how information came to light, and maybe certain details that we've since overlooked. For example, Shanann or somebody deleting Shanann's Instagram account. That's happened a couple of months ago. So we're going to go into that. Before we get there, some good news. My book, Murder Most Foul, which is my 95th book, has just been published on Amazon. It's quite a long book, around about 361 pages. I know when I started writing it, I just thought I would write a short book, almost like the first Watts book, and it ended up being quite a story, quite a convoluted, twisting tale. There are so many similarities to the Watts case, it's not funny. There's just, if you just take, for example, CERVI 319 in the Watts case, this rural installation that one had to get to know. The Frazee Ranch has also got that sort of aspect. And that's not all. There's also the dodgy surveillance footage, a unreliable mistress, and so on. So if you're interested in the Frazee case, there is a section dealing with intertextualities in the book, so you're welcome to look at that. Throughout the book I have made a couple of, how can I put it, I've related the Frazee case to the Watts case, but I've also been quite clear to show certain areas that are completely different. Meanwhile, on Patreon, I've put up another analysis, quite a deep analysis of criminal confessions, dealing with the riskiest move made by the interrogators. And then I've just covered a couple of areas within that discussion. And so you can go to Patreon and have a look at that. Thus far, I haven't even gone into the episode of criminal confessions in a lot of detail. I've kind of just glossed over what has been reported in the media. I have since watched the full episode and kind of studied it, and so I'm going to be dealing with it in depth, the full episode, not just what has been made available to the media. So that will be done on crimerocket.com through a series of posts. I will also be doing some analysis of that episode, just certain aspects that I want to highlight on this channel, and then also on Patreon, just certain things that maybe are sort of very deep and detailed. So look out for that. Before we get to today's episode on What Else Do We Know, please subscribe, like, share, leave a comment, and let's get started. So 3 episodes into What Else Do We Know, and we're at point number 43. There's quite a lot to go through. This is going to be a relatively short episode, but as usual, just in kind of scrolling through the details that I put down chronologically, it's quite fascinating to look at what we've known and certain things we've forgotten about, and certain things that are maybe worth reviewing out of the context that we knew it at the time. So we start with point number 43, which is just the statement that the girls' bodies were submerged in crude oil for 4 days. So this was known fairly early on, but it was also forgotten almost as soon as we knew it. The fact that the children's bodies were submerged in oil is very idiosyncratic to the Watts case. I really can't think of any other case that I even know of where you have a situation like this. There are some cases that I've certainly heard of, and I think I've seen in documentaries where someone was put in a drum and perhaps thrown into a river. But the closest high-profile case to this scenario is Scott Peterson. He disposed of his wife's body in San Francisco Bay, and instead of it being 4 days, that was 3 months. And so in that case, and I think this is what prepared me for the work that needed to be done on this case. I had to study the effects of seawater on the human remains. There is a slight amount of acid in seawater, very, very slight. But even more importantly, I do study the effects of aquatic creatures. I do study the biosphere in San Francisco Bay and ocean currents and all sorts of things. And so that kind of detail basically gave me the ammunition to and the sort of just the knowledge, the technical knowledge of what is required to go into all those sort of details when I was confronted with this unknown scenario of the oil tanks. I knew that I'd go and study up about the ingredients in oil. I also had to study about the temperatures and just the processes involved in extracting these particular chemicals, and then also to study up some of the actual chemical interactions, both singularly, so the impact of one chemical on certain tissues, and then in the human body, and then also the impact of kind of almost a potpourri, almost a spectrum of chemicals in kind of a mixture, and including water. What kind of impact would they have? And then the other dimension, of course, was if there are chemicals in the human body, what would happen to them, and specifically oxycodone. So all of that comes from just that point number 43. And as I say, I think a lot of people have just sort of, it's like the horror of it, of the children being submerged in oil, but no one has really thought beyond that emotional equation. No one has actually thought what would actually happen here. And in a weird way, I think a lot of people just assume that if someone is put into oil, nothing really happens. But a lot does happen. If you're aware of what oil can do to metal, and what certain of the ingredients in crude oil can do to living creatures. If you think of oil slicks, and you think of just the burning sensation and that smell that you get in your body when you're exposed to these things, your eyes water and burn. You must know that it's a poisonous compound that one is dealing with, and just breathing in the fumes of crude oil can cause what's known as chemical pneumonia. It's just got obvious things that damage the human body. It irritates the nose, the throat, the lungs, can cause dizziness, drowsiness, it can cause fatigue and nausea, it can cause difficulty breathing, and chronic exposure can cause even worse symptoms, irregular heartbeat, convulsions, coma. So these are seriously dangerous chemicals. They, a lot of them, a lot of some of the chemicals in crude oil are carcinogenic. And I think I dealt with a lot of that aspect in the book Rape of Cassandra, which kind of stepped away from the Watts narrative to an extent and looked at the broader topography and the broader machines involved in this case, including the CERVI ranch and also Anadarko and Lavelle. It was just sort of looking at them kind of as characters in the story as well. And then point number 44 was that the bodies of the children were submerged in separate tanks. And that again is also a interesting point. I actually covered this a little bit in the latest episode that I've put up on Patreon, so I'm not going to go into it here. I do think the discussion on this so far has been quite silly. But yeah, I'm not going to go into that here. Point number 45 was that Shanann was buried near 2 oil tanks. And this is the first time that I've spelt Shanann's name correct in this particular chronology. I got her name wrong early on, but as soon as I saw the way that it was spelled, then I corrected it, and I took inspiration from the funeral and what was said on her grave and what was said in the funeral notice, and I haven't changed that since. I have noticed that even a year and a half later, most people spell her name wrong. Most media companies also spell her name wrong. I noticed Dr. Phil in the beginning stuck to the convention of Shanann with the apostrophe. Not quite sure what they're doing now, but I've certainly maintained that spelling ever since. People may say, well, that's not how she spelled her name on Facebook, but I'm not sure if Facebook would have accepted it with that apostrophe. In any event, that is the first time that I changed the spelling of her name, and then number 46, Watts worked at the location until he was arrested. I'm not quite sure what I meant by that, but I think what I meant was, that he worked at CERVI 319, right? He was employed by Anadarko, but he was literally not just at the site disposing of the bodies, but he was actually pretending to work there, and he was working there. So it wasn't as if he just went to the site and then went somewhere else. He went to the site under the what do you call it, under the sort of ruse, under the guise of, well, I'm going there because there's something that I need to do there. And so again, this is something that a lot of people don't recognize. It was quite clever and quite sly to hide what he meant to do in something that he had to do. And it's as a result of this that a lot of people either don't know the crime was premeditated, or simply think Watts was stupid and made it up as he went along. And Watts wasn't stupid. In the episode I've just done on Patreon, I just spoke about for how many hours Watts was subjected to a barrage of interrogation from not one but two agents, one from the FBI, one from the CBI. I'm not sure how many ordinary people could withstand that without cracking, but Watts actually withstood consistent, careful, meticulous, systematic, strategic questioning without actually giving anything away for a really, really long time. And the first crack that formed was really when Nicole Keshen just said, she was having an affair, and they then had that information to tell him, to say, we know you've been hiding something. And that was actually how the first crack happened. And so people, I think, to some extent, underestimate Watts's guile and his game. Not saying that he's a very smart criminal, but I think he's smarter than a lot of people give him credit for. Yeah, and so basically, once Watts left the oil site, he never worked another day in his life again. Once he left CERVI 319 and went home, that was basically it. It was just a matter of hours before he was arrested. One does wonder if Watts had just not returned home, what would have happened. If Watts was at CERVI 319, the police were calling, and what if he just said, guys, Shanann said she's going to see a friend. I don't know what you're worrying about, and just left it at that. Maybe, the police wouldn't have gotten access to the scene then, and maybe they wouldn't have spoken to the neighbor then. Maybe even his surveillance footage would have been, wiped out. I just think it's an interesting thought experiment. Then number 47, the Watts couple married in North Carolina less than 6 years ago in 2012. Now some people may be interested. I received a chapter from Catherine Hudson on the marriage. I don't think it's been seen by anyone. I'm wondering what to do with it. I may discuss it here, but at this point it's simply just I think what she did was she got access to the wedding footage and just really is expressing commentary about it, so we can maybe look at that at some stage, but to just go back to 47, you can see the Watts couple weren't really together that long. They were married less than 6 years. It's not a really, really long time to be married. And Watts wasn't a very experienced guy with women. His relationship with Shanann was his longest relationship. And whereas Shanann, on the other hand, had been married before. And that's quite a mystery, is exactly what happened there. And it's quite a difference between her first husband and Watts. Her first husband was a lawyer, and Watts was just a different personality. So one wonders why that first marriage didn't work out. We've got some information about it, but it would be interesting to hear what Leonard King has to say in a lot more detail. So then point number 48, the Watts family moved to Colorado soon after getting married. That also seems to be kind of a strange thing, is they get married and then they leave town. They kind of got married and then they left, and they also, Shanann sort of left her home quite suddenly and kind of left her furniture in it as well. Just seemed a little bit strange. Don't people often get married once they've moved somewhere? Don't people often, when everything's been sort of put in place, you've got the job wherever you're going, you know what I mean? Don't you get married once that's in place? You don't first get married and then put those things in place. I do have a really good friend of mine where that wasn't the case, but that required a heck of a lot of faith and love and support from his wife to know that ultimately things were going to work out, so and things did work out, but in the Watts case it didn't. One could argue that Shanann's work life never quite panned out into something stable and something kind of effective, where she was earning an effective income. I know a lot of people will say, no, she was stable, she was happy, she was enjoying her work, she was earning a good living, but then I would counter that by saying, well, if that was true, what was she doing in North Carolina for 5-6 weeks? Because that trip was ostensibly to to work on her income, to work on her bottom line, and it seems like it was kind of a failure, because when she went there, her video output went down. When you look at her kind of events, Thrive-based events, she had a couple, but I'm not sure how big they were, but 5 or 6 weeks, anybody going on a business trip of 5 or 6 weeks, that's huge, especially if you're pregnant, while you're pregnant, taking your children along on this business trip. So I'm just trying to show that I don't know if things were that stable. I don't know if Thrive made things more stable for the Watts family. And one could take it even further and say, as a result of this attempt to address their economic situation, it provided Watts with an opportunity to have an affair. And that's how unstable things had gotten. Point number 49, on Tuesday, the day before his arrest on Wednesday, August 15th, Watts issued a televised plea for the return of his wife and daughters. The plea occurred on the morning after the murder. Now, although this may be common knowledge to us now, and in the era now, I remember being kind of confused for quite a while. It just wasn't clear to me what was the sort of context of the sermon on the porch. I think for a while I assumed that it had happened the day that they disappeared. In other words, on Monday, that Watts had come home from work and was looking for his family and then spoke to the media. I think that was my first impression. And then I think that changed to that I thought it had happened, I think, on a Wednesday, but based on the fact that the media and social media only really picked up on the sermon on the porch basically on the Wednesday. I mean, it was broadcast live on Tuesday, but it had sort of reverberated around the world by kind of Thursday. And so the timing of it took a while to kind of figure out what was going on. It didn't seem important to do that anyway, because it seemed like, my first response was, okay, well, this guy's clearly guilty, and we'll see what happens, kind of thing. And I didn't really think I was going to study the Watts case in any further detail. Everything just seemed very obvious, and I think it seemed obvious to everybody. And that's also the weird part of this case, is there's so much that's incredibly obvious that it seems to distract us from the so many things that aren't obvious. For example, like what happens inside the oil drums. What was the information that was deleted? When did the premeditation start? Was oxy used? What's going on with the autopsy reports? Do we have access to all of them? Anyway, I'm not going to go into that any further. But the fact that this happened when it did, and that the dogs, you could also hear dogs barking, was quite important to bear in mind, that the media came the next day, so Watts had a chance to rest and recover and think about stuff. We didn't know then specifically about Nicole Kessinger, but we now know that instead of resting after what he'd done, he was up late at night talking to Nicole again. So that may not have been a very good idea from his perspective. And then after speaking to the media, that very night he was at Frederick Police Station talking to Coda for 4 hours. So again, one wonders, if he didn't speak to the media, what would have happened? Because him speaking to the media made this case very high profile and certainly got the attention of law enforcement. So that's also interesting, is if he hadn't spoken to the media, would the FBI have had maybe less to go on? Because that was kind of his first statement. In other words, the FBI could look at that, what he'd said to the media, and that could be a basis for how they were going to question him, what they were going to ask him, what their strategy would be, how they were going to treat this guy who seemed to be projecting the Mr. Nice Guy thing. And isn't that what law enforcement did? They played the Mr. Nice Guy thing as well. Nothing to fear from us. We're not going to sort of put your ass in a sling for the rest of your life. We are here to help. We are your friend. The same kind of Mr. Nice Guy spiel. And Okay, and then number 50, according to Chris Watts' 2015 paycheck, he was paying $1.20 per month in child life insurance and $3 per month in spouse life insurance. And I think we got that information from HLN. I'm not 100% sure, but I think that's where it came from. And then it also referred to bi-weekly earnings of $2,400. And so what was also interesting here was you just had no information on Shanann's paycheck. Even then, no information about what she was earning, no information on whether she was paying any insurance, but I mean that remains the case today. We still don't know what Shanann earned. Point number 51, murder is punishable by death in Colorado. If we just refer to the discovery just before the polygraph questions anyway, Tammy Lee asked Chris, what did she think would happen to Chris if his wife and children were murdered? What should happen to the person who did it? And then Chris said, the worst possible thing. And when she asked Chris to explain what that was, he said, well, either life in prison or the death penalty. And that's why it's quite ironic that now that he's in jail, he says, well, he doesn't really think it's right that he should spend the rest of his life in jail. Well, it's not what he said there. Interestingly, what Agent Lee said here was another version of what Coda said the previous night. And when he asked, Chris Watts, interestingly, he said, I'm not sure if the death penalty is even used. Is it used in Colorado? He says, I'm not sure. And then, interestingly, Coda doesn't really answer that. He just says, okay. He doesn't actually take him through the legalities or the history. And if he did, what should have been reassured? The death penalty is not really going to be on the agenda here. And just taking the word death in the discovery, it's interesting that what's expressed to Shanann that he literally said, I'm scared to death about having this third child. Just think about those words in the context of what happened. To say, I'm scared to death. I'm very sensitive to colorful language as an author. I know when I use colorful language what I'm trying to do. And Watts also uses expressions like sick to my stomach, and if you think about that in terms of putting someone in oil or poisoning them, it also brings that kind of image to mind. So something I thought I would just share with you with regards to that. Coming back to point 52, after his family went missing, Chris didn't stay in their empty house alone. So on Monday night he stayed there alone, but on Tuesday night he stayed with the Thayers. And I didn't know this at the time. I don't think anyone knew this at the time, but that wasn't by choice. It wasn't like he could have gone back to his home Tuesday night. So from the interrogation at the police station, he couldn't have just gone home. And the reason is Coda asked him if they can do a proper kind of CSI search of the house. They were going to use, I think they called it black lighting. They were going to test for DNA. They were going to basically just go through that house with a fine-tooth comb, with luminol, blue story agents, and just check everything. And Watts was quite fine with it. He was sort of like, yeah, that's fine. And at the time that he did it, I thought that was really foolish and false bravado. But I think Watts backed himself that he cleaned that house sufficiently that he had nothing to worry about. And we don't know for sure what was found during that search, but it doesn't seem like there was any terribly incriminating information found. I mean, in the warrantless arrest affidavit, it doesn't say where the crime scene was in terms of Shanann. It doesn't actually say. We don't know for a fact where Shanann was killed, other than that it was inside the house somewhere. In terms of Nick and Amanda Thayer, I refer to them quite a lot in my first narratives, just because they also provided quite a lot of information to the media. I think one of the interviews was 30 minutes long or so. So if we had the Sermon on the Porch, we also had that. In hindsight, a lot of what they have said has been forgotten, but one should bear in mind, if everyone thought that Chris Watts was a dummy and didn't have social currency, well, they were both at the house while he was giving the Sermon on the Porch. They kind of believed Chris, and so much so that they invited him to their home and put a roof over his head and gave him a bed opposite their child's bedroom. And they got a lot of they were vilified by social media. They still defended Chris Watts, and then obviously the tide turned. He got arrested, and then they actually went on TV again and apologized. They apologized for putting themselves in danger, I guess, and also for not being aware of perhaps what they could have been aware of. I felt like I had kind of a bit in common with Nick Thayer, just because I also have a background as a photographer, and I actually was a little bit in contact with him when we were when I was writing the first book or two, and there were one or two emails between him and me, so I think the people that are at the center of this case that I have had contact with, not a lot but a little, were Nickolel Atkinson and Nick Thayer. Beyond them, there was one other one, Jeremy Lindstrom, I think, contacted me on Facebook with a comment, but other than them, I haven't had any direct contact with any of the other people involved in this case. I have had indirect contact with Chris Watts through that. It was me. I got it from the basement recording that he made. I mean, I asked for it and it was sent, but I obviously didn't speak to him directly. So in episode I'm going to be doing quite soon on Cindy Watts, I'll also be just dealing with the day that photo was taken with Cindy Watts in the background in the paddle pool. I was just curious about what happened on that day, so again I asked a third party to ask this question, and so I'm just going to be dealing with that in another episode, dealing with the enmity with the ruses. And then if we go back to 54, Amanda Thayer sort of provided some insight into how Shanann thought of Chris Watts, and maybe to some extent how she thought of Chris Watts, and how a lot of people thought of Chris Watts, that he wasn't the kind of guy to have an affair. He was too shy, he was too reserved, he was too introverted, he was too lacking in social game to do it. And so this is a quote from her. This is point number 55 from Amanda Thayer, saying, honestly, she, meaning Shanann, wasn't worried. But then she says, when your husband doesn't answer his text messages, as a woman, your thought process just goes to the wrong things. And then she says, it was never a serious concern of hers. And so what she was talking about is, while Shanann was in North Carolina, Chris Watts just stopped regularly answering his text messages, or answering them promptly. It would sometimes take him a while to respond. And Shanann didn't really take that very seriously. Big mistake, as it turned out. And Amanda wasn't worried, but it turned out that it did need to be a serious concern. And that brings us to the final point in this episode, number 56, that Shanann met Chris online. And we see that Nicole Kessinger is also meeting people online. It's obviously the way of the millennials these days. But she met Chris during a dark period 8 years before the murder. So that's quite important to bear in mind, is that when she met Chris, she was herself going through a dark period. She was in a vulnerable position, and when Chris Watts encountered her, his impression of her as also kind of a quiet person, also as a not necessarily introverted, but someone who was sort of in a weakened condition in a way, may have made her seem not a threat to him, if I can put it that way. You know, if you compare both Shanann and Watts through the course of their marriage, and I did a blog post on this, who changed the most? And you talk about physical changes, maybe Chris Watts changed the most. I'm not sure if that's strictly speaking true. I think they both changed a lot, but certainly Chris Watts changed so much that he was so attractive to the opposite sex that he was eventually having an affair. So one could argue that physically Watts changed more. But I mean, what about personality wise? What about how did thrive and being on social media all the time and being almost forced to do daily videos of yourself and daily selfies and all that kind of thing? How did that change Shanann's personality from this dark period? And did this start grating them in terms of their relationship, in terms of their marriage? And I can tell you, just doing these YouTube videos has changed my behavior quite a lot. It's changed my ability to sleep at night, because I've got to worry about uploading, and is it uploaded, and then there's a certain response to some of them. But not only that, I find it quite exhausting. I find it quite exhausting talking for such a long time, to the extent that when I sometimes talk to other people, I don't really have anything to say. Certainly not about the Chris Watts case. And so it does have an impact. Okay, and I think that's about it. We'll continue with this next week in episode 4, where we go into some of the admissions Shanann makes about her private life. Some of them have disappeared because of Instagram being taken down, but fortunately I did record some of what she said, and I took some screen grabs of Instagram, so that's not lost. But we will continue with this next week in episode 4. As I mentioned earlier, my book on Patrick Frazee is out, so please check that out. I'll be providing some behind-the-scenes discussions on Patreon, just about what went into the writing of the book, and a couple of excerpts as well. And then look out for just more discussion on psychology, just debunking the narcissism narrative. That's going to be coming up on this channel over the course of the following week. And besides the extensions to that on Patreon, I'm also going to be going through the full episode of Criminal Confessions on crimerocket.com, and some of that will obviously flow over onto here as well. Thank you for listening, and I'll see you guys next time.